Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Silberstein, and welcome to my final presentation, Borderline Personality Disorder Through the Lens of Cognitive Neuroscience. Borderline personality disorder is defined as a mental disorder characterized by unstable moods, behavior, and relationships. And I became interested in this disorder while reading a casebook from another class, Abnormal Psychology. And this casebook featured each chapter was a different mental disorder, and we read it alongside as we learned about each disorder in class. And borderline personality disorder was the only case throughout the entire book that did not result in a happy ending. The woman in the chapter ended up killing herself, and this caused me to become aware of personality disorders and their complexity and what sets them apart from other symptom disorders. And I included a picture of Pete Davidson on this slide because he is a public figure who's been very outspoken about his struggles with borderline personality disorder. And I found that this image sums up borderline personality disorder very well at a glance. We see regular thinking, which has color, contrast, slanted lines, which represent that things can be seen from different points of view. And then we have borderline thinking, which has black and white, and they don't intersect. And this represents all or nothing or good or bad thinking. And it's easy to see who someone whose thinking and way of life is primarily governed by this mentality has severe impairments in mood, behavior, and relationships. Here is my table of contents, and although borderline personality disorder was defined on the last slide, it must also be explained in terms of DSM-5 criteria, and I'm also going to explain the difference between personality and symptom disorders that is essential for proving the complexity of personality disorders. Next, I divided my research into articles that focus more on neurological impacts of borderline personality disorder and behavioral impacts of borderline personality disorder, although these two sections can be very connected, which is cool to see throughout the presentation. Lastly, I will wrap up by talking about the stigma around personality disorders as a whole and also provide some key takeaways before we finish. Here's the DSM-5 criteria of borderline personality disorder. There are three clusters of personality disorders, clusters A, B, and C. And when defining a disorder, you must also explain it in terms of the larger cluster that it fits into. So there's the borderline personality disorder criteria. And then since it fits into cluster B, there are the criteria at large for all cluster B disorders. So cluster B disorders are dramatic, irrational, and emotional. And specifically, borderline personality disorders have instability, impulsivity, and fear of abandonment. And borderline personality disorder is definitely the most emotional of the four cluster B disorders. So here you could see all four. We have antisocial, borderline, the person is crying, histrionic, and narcissistic. And giving these criteria in comparison with these, it's easy to see the connection between why borderline personality disorder fits under cluster B. So although both symptom and personality disorders are forms of mental illness, there are differences that make personality disorders much, much harder to treat. So symptom disorders are when there is one key disturbance to a person's thoughts or feelings, and this is what's worked on throughout treatment. So an example would be anxiety. The key disturbance is worry, and this is what's treated through talk therapy and medication. It's very easy to pinpoint. Personality disorders, on the other hand, everything is slightly off kilter, and this provides the important philosophical question of how can you fix what makes a person who they are? So there's not one aspect that's easy to treat throughout personality disorders, and this is why they are so complex. So a key difference in the brains of people with borderline personality disorder is a reduction in gray matter volume in the brain. So gray matter is the substance in our brain, and white matter makes up the connections between different brain areas. So here's an image that shows gray and white matter, and I like to provide the analogy that it's like the earth. So the gray matter is the neurons, but that would be the green, the earth, the land, and then the white matter would be the blue, the ocean that connects everything. So borderline personality disorder is highly comorbid with depression, and this is unsurprising due to the emotional upheaval of having borderline personality disorder, and this often leads to isolation. And this was seen in the case study that I mentioned briefly in the beginning. So once it was established that borderline personality disorder is associated with a reduction in gray matter volume, scientists wanted to see if depression makes this reduction in gray matter volume any worse. And it was found that it doesn't. Depression is simply comorbid, and those with borderline personality disorder and depression have similar looking brains to those with simply just borderline personality disorder. Unlike depression, experiencing abuse as a child can severely alter the brain. And experiencing abuse as a child can go so far as to bring out borderline personality disorder in a child who was pregenetically exposed. So this is the gene-environment interaction that we're talking about here. So when an individual experiences child abuse, the entire circuitry of the brain is thrown off course. So not just gray matter, but white matter as well. So it shows that the changes in the brain are more significant than those that were caused by borderline personality disorder. And in terms of social cognition, there are obviously separate tells in social interactions. If one has been abused as a child, it's very easy to tell in school through their behavior, through the way they behave and interact. They are often very erratic, very paranoid. And there are certain traits of borderline personality disorder that make a lot of sense if we're comparing them to traits of child abuse, such as fear of abandonment. And this abuse can often bring out this borderline personality trait. So identity, memory, and affect consciousness are all severely impacted by borderline personality disorder and are all connected as well. So individuals with borderline personality disorder do not usually have an identity or a strong identity outside of their diagnosis. There's not a lot of room for joy left. They're very hard on themselves. And also a weakened autobiographical memory plays a huge role in this lack of identity. So for those with borderline personality disorder, they often have trouble remembering good events that have happened to them, but they remember negative events as much worse than they were. So for example, someone who's borderline, if they had a fight with their partner, they would remember it in a much stronger magnitude as being much more detrimental to the relationship than it actually was. And both of these things contribute to a blunted affect, which is a lack of excitement, monotone expressions, which makes social interaction much harder for someone with borderline personality disorder. And also affect consciousness can be seen in those with antisocial personality disorders as well. So this brings us into talking about current treatment norms. And currently treatment for borderline personality disorder is focused on crisis management and suicide and self-harm prevention. But a treatment suggestion that has been proven to work through a long-term longitudinal study is giving people a reason to want to live through building up their identity and their sense of self. And both are important. This treatment suggestion works with suicide prevention as part of it, but it just shows that we need both the weekly suicide prevention tactic along with building up a person's sense of identity and self-image to see long-term improvement. And I just want to circle back that at the core, abnormal brain functioning and cognitive deficits are at the root of all of these issues, which is why I wanted to present on this topic and relate it back to cognitive neuroscience. So lastly, we're going to switch up the gears a little bit and talk about a stereotype of personality disorders at large. So there's a strong association between criminality and other devious acts and personality disorders. And although a few criminals have actually been diagnosed with personality disorders, some of the most famous have been, and they were diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder specifically. And this has caused a great misrepresentation and the image between personality disorders and criminality to be skewed in people's brains. So within antisocial personality disorder, there are even more specific traits that bring out criminality. And this one is callous unemotional traits, low callous unemotional traits. And callous unemotional means the ability to essentially cause harm without feeling compassion. So hitting someone and not feeling any regret, not wanting to apologize, but obviously on a much larger scale. And you must have this low callous unemotional trait to complete a criminal or devious act. And another devious act that can be criminal, sometimes cannot be, is sexual compulsivity. And this is specifically seen in college age boys with antisocial personality disorder. So to wrap up, here are my key takeaways. So first, personality disorders encompass a person's entire personality, and therefore they are much harder to treat. But due to the widespread impacts of borderline personality disorder, new treatments are coming to light that can help an individual gain a sense of identity outside of the instability of their disorder. And lastly, stereotypes around criminality and personality disorders are very dangerous and inaccurate, and awareness must be presented to stop perpetuating these stereotypes. Here are my references. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye.